Good morning, everyone. It's great to be with you in worship today. I want to say a special word of welcome to those of you who are in Amesbury worshiping with us via video. It's great to be coming and sharing this time with you. A couple of weeks ago, we started this new teaching series. We're talking about what it is to be a true friend of God and what it is to be a true follower of Christ, and kind of playing off some of that imagery in our culture now with Facebook friends and Twitter followers and all these ways that those words have been kind of co-opted by our culture as of late. And a couple of weeks ago, we started talking about one of those attributes of what it is to be a true friend, a true follower of Christ. And we talked about that head-to-heart journey. We talked about how that often our faith begins intellectually. It's something we come to know and understand, but we don't necessarily have that heart knowledge where it really becomes a part of us. And so part of what it means to become a true follower of Christ is to have that faith become more than just cognitive, but something of the heart. And then last week, we talked a little bit about how being a true follower of Christ is to be able to live unashamed. To not feel as though we need to hide our faith in any way, but to be willing to live it openly, not in a way that puts others down or is off-putting to others or makes others uncomfortable even, but in a way that just shines the light of Christ, in a way that lets others see the Jesus in us, and recognizing that there will be those who maybe are uncomfortable with that, but nonetheless, we are called to be who we are. We're called to live out this faith as Christ has given us. And it should not be something that is hidden or disguised in any way. And so we've talked about these two attributes, and today we're going to go on to a third of what it means to be a true friend and true follower of Christ. Now today we're going to look a little bit at the Pharisees, because they have something to teach us. What do you know about the Pharisees? Think about what you've learned in the past. What do you think of? What do you envision when you think about the Pharisees? First of all, you probably know that they are a part of a ruling class, if you will. They were the ruling council there in Jerusalem, made up of certain Pharisees. And so many of them were in positions of power and authority, and in some ways sort of a political role. So we know that about them. We also know that they were knowledgeable, well-educated. They had been trained up, often from their childhood. And they were experts in the law. And when we talk about the law, we're not talking about civil law, we're talking about the law of God. They were experts in the Old Testament. They knew the law of God inside and out. They had committed massive portions of the scriptures to memory. So they knew the law. And so, by nature and by teaching, they were very rule-oriented. They knew the legalism of the law. They knew what it was all about. And their understanding of faith was that they were knowledgeable in the rules. And so as such, we end up with a group or a category of people who are very legalistic. That is to say, it is all about for them the rules and following the legalism of that was an expression of our faith, that faith was understood to be legalism. And as such, they were often judgmental because they would compare their legalism to the legalism of others. And they measured faith by adherence to the rules. And so the better you were at living up to the rules, the more faithful you were. That was their understanding of what it meant to be faithful. To be faithful to God meant to live up to the rules and to the laws and to know the law and to abide by it. And so what ended up happening over time is they became experts at living by the letter of the law while working around the spirit of the law. So they were very good at being able to say, I follow this rule, and I follow that rule, and I do this, and I do that, even if it meant they were violating the spirit of the law. That didn't matter to them. What mattered to them is that they were living up to the letter of the law, the legalism of the law. And this is a picture of who it was that Jesus speaks out against today. Jesus actually in many places, we've drawn one section here, but in many places speaks out against this sort of legalism of the Pharisees. Because what we end up with in the Pharisees is essentially a person who is very concerned about the external, but really gives very little attention to the internal. In other words, they are all show and no substance. It's all about what's on the outside. We use an expression sometimes, a mile wide and an inch deep. That their faith was not something that was deep within them. We talked about that head-to-heart knowledge. It hadn't taken off on that journey to the heart. It wasn't deep within them. It was very broad, and they knew a lot. But it wasn't in here. And as such, it was often about perception more than reality. What mattered to them is how they were perceived outwardly, how people saw them, what they looked like on the outside. And as long as it looked good on the outside, they really didn't care about what was inward, the state of their heart, if you will. And so the Pharisees, by the most classic definition of the word, lacked integrity. Understand what integrity is? And we use that word a lot, but the root meaning, the base meaning of that word integrity is a consistency through and through. In other words, if something is the same on the inside as it is on the outside, if at the heart it's the same as it is on the edges, then there is an integrity to that. That term really was originally used with structurally. We talk about the structural integrity of a piece of steel or a piece of lumber. And so if steel were of good quality, it had structural integrity, it was the same at the heart, at the core of that steel as it was on the outside, on the surface. And so there weren't impurities mixed in with it. It didn't have flaws hidden inside. There was an integrity to it. And so to have integrity meant to be the same through and through. And so by that classic definition, the Pharisees lacked integrity. They were not the same through and through. They were one way on the outside. They were very different on the inside. And this is what Jesus calls them out on. In this passage and several others like this, Jesus confronts the Pharisees about their lack of integrity, about the fact that the inside and the outside did not match up, that there was an inconsistency there. Listen to this. Let's break this scripture down a little bit. Woe to you, teachers of the law and Pharisees, you hypocrites! You give a tenth of your spices, of mint and dill and cumin, but you have neglected the more important things of the law: justice, mercy, faithfulness. See, this is an expression of legalism. They were so legalistic about their tithing. You understand what tithing is? Everyone was expected to give 1/10 of all that God had blessed them with back to the temple, back to the service of God. And so they were so intentional about their tithing that they would even tithe their mint, their dill, their oregano, their parsley, if you will, down to the slightest thing. And yet they neglected justice and mercy and the things that were at the heart of the law. I mean, why do we tithe? We tithe to be a blessing to others. We tithe to express compassion. We tithe so that we've got resources to be able to help others make a difference in the lives of those around us. And so they were concerned about the legalism of tithing, but they weren't concerned about the end goal of it. And so he shows that inconsistency. And then again in verse 24, you blind guides, you strain out a gnat. You know what a gnat is, right? Tiny little bug. You strain out a gnat, but you swallow a camel. In other words, you get caught up in the minutia, the little details of the law. You worry about every little iota, if you will, of the law. That was a little dot over the I, basically. You worry about every little iota, but you don't worry about the big things, the things that matter to me, the significant parts, the underlying intention of the law. So they were concerned about these little things, but ignore the big things. And then jumping ahead to verse 27, woe to you, teachers of the law and Pharisees, you hypocrites! You're like whitewashed tombs, which look beautiful on the outside, but on the inside are full of the bones of the dead and everything unclean. In the same way, on the outside, you appear to people as righteous, but on the inside, you are full of hypocrisy and wickedness. So he's saying you put on a facade, you put on this outward appearance. You understand what he means by a whitewashed tomb? The tomb, of course, was this place where they would bury people. And so they'd wrap them, prepare them for burial, and they'd take them to the tomb and place them in there. And so picture that. You've got this cave, if you will, full of dead bodies. So on the inside, it's death. But imagine you come along on the outside and you paint it all up really pretty. Whitewash it, they say. Paint it up really nice. So it looks beautiful on the outside, but in fact, if you open it up and go inside, it's full of death. That's the way he describes them. On the outside, you look so pretty. You're all cleaned up. You're pure white. But on the inside, you're full of wickedness, hypocrisy, and sin. Now, what's important to notice here, I think, in this passage is that Jesus doesn't actually say that it ought to be either or, that we ought to either look good on the inside or look good on the outside. He actually says it ought to be both. If we go back to verse 23, you got to see where he follows up on that. He says, you neglect justice, mercy, faithfulness. And then he says, you should have practiced the latter, justice, mercy, faithfulness, without neglecting the former. So he's saying it does matter. It does matter that on the outside we are living in a way that is godly. We want to be a good witness. We want people to see the difference that God is making in our lives. That does matter, but it has to coincide with what's on the inside. It can't just be outside. And so he's saying it's got to be integrity. It's got to be the same through and through. It can't only be facade. It should be both. It won't be facade. If it's true on the inside, it's not facade anymore. It's a genuine reflection of what's in our hearts. And so Jesus isn't saying, it doesn't actually matter what you look on the outside, it only matters what you look like on the inside. He's saying, no, it ought to be both. We ought to present Christ well to the world. But if we do that, it needs to be a true reflection of what's inside of us. I think what Jesus is saying basically is that our faith, for us today, as we apply this to our own lives, our faith needs to have integrity. It needs to be consistent. I'm going to borrow a term from the computer world. Do y'all know what WYSIWYG means? You ever heard that term? W-Y-S-I-W-Y-G. WYSIWYG. You ever heard that term? Anybody know what that term means? It's is that an acrostic? Is that when one letter it means something in every word? I think that's what it's called. Anyways, it's this phrase that means what you see is what you get. It's a computer term. So when you're doing type layout, one format is what's called WYSIWYG. It shows up on the screen exactly as it's going to appear when you print it. Well, we need to be WYSIWYG. We need to be in our faith life. What you see is what you get. It needs to be a true reflection. It can't be that what's on the outside is different from what's being inputted from the inside. There's another section that I want us to turn to for a minute. So if you have your Bibles, I invite you to follow me. I'm going to go back to Matthew chapter 6. First verses 1 through 5, and then we'll jump up to verse 15. Be careful not to practice your righteousness in front of others to be seen by them. If you do, you will have no reward from your Father in heaven. So when you give to the needy, do not announce it with trumpets, as the hypocrites do in the synagogue and on the streets to be honored by others. Truly, I tell you, they have received their reward in full. But when you give to the needy, do not even let your left hand know what your right hand is doing, so that your giving may be in secret. Then your Father, who sees what is done in secret, will reward you. And when you pray, Do not be like the hypocrites, for they love to pray standing in the synagogues or on the street corners to be seen by others. Truly I say to you, they have received the reward in full. And jumping down to verse 15. When you fast, do not be like the hypocrites do, for they disfigure their faces to show to others that they are fasting. Truly they have received their reward in full. But when you fast, put oil on your head and wash your face, so that it will not be obvious to others that you are fasting, but only to your Father who is unseen. And your Father who sees what is done in secret will reward you. You understand what he means when he says they've already received their reward? When we do these things, when we live our faith in a way that's all about show, it's all about what others see and wanting those around us to applaud our righteousness, our faithfulness. When it's all done for facade, when it's all just out there and we're making a big deal of it where everyone can see it. What Jesus is saying is, you know what? You've already received your reward. Your reward is you got the applause of those around you. You got the admiration of the crowd, the accolades. But don't expect your reward from God. Your reward was you did it for show and you got the show. And so he's saying that, I believe he's saying that to be a true friend of God, to be a true follower of Christ, certainly we want to live a good outward witness, but it must never be facade. It can't be for show. That's not what we're about. It's not why we do this. We don't live out our faith for the applause of man. We don't live our faith out in a way that everyone's going to see it and tell us how wonderful we are. It comes down to it. To be a true friend of God, to be a true follower of Christ, is to be truthfully more concerned about the inside than the outside. The outside matters, don't misunderstand me. We want to be a good witness. But ultimately what matters, what we need to be most concerned about is what's going on the inside. Because if the outside is only show and the inside's not where it should be, if the heart is not right, then we're missing everything. I mean, do you see why that's important? Do you understand why it matters that we live our faith life out with integrity in a way that is true inwardly? First of all, it's important for our own well-being. Do you know how hard it is to keep up a show every day? To put on a facade day after day, week after week as we come to church and put on this big show and pretend and wear this mask. It's exhausting. It is very hard, very tiring to put on. So for our own sake, there needs to be integrity. There needs to be a match, because you don't have to work at it if you're not pretending. If it's a natural reflection of how you feel and who you are inside, then that's not effort. The outward is just a natural reflection of the inward. But if we're having to pretend all the time for our own well-being, we need to stop. It's not good for us. And truthfully, it's not good for our witness, because you know what? Sooner or later, people see through it. Sooner or later, people come to recognize that that's not really who we are. They know us. They get to know us a little bit in those intimate moments. They see us when our guard is dropped for a minute. And it's not pretty. And it's not a good witness when we've pretended to be one thing and then they see us as something else. It harms our ability to witness to Christ. So this whole thing of dropping the facade, of letting go of that sort of pharisaical image, we need it for our own sake. We need to stop doing that for our own mental health, for our own well-being, because it's just exhausting trying to be somebody you're not. But we also need to do it for the sake of our witness and our testimony. It does not help. Why do you think people so often look at Christians as if they were hypocrites? Because we try too hard to put on these masks, pretend to be someone we're not. I guess another way of looking at it would be to say that as a true friend, a true follower of Christ, we need to be honest. in our faith. We need to be honest about where we are with our faith. And you know what? That is going to include those areas that maybe don't look good on the outside. See, this is why I think we often put on the facade, because there are things within us that if we let them show on the outside, we might be embarrassed by. Or we might feel uncomfortable with it. We might be fearful of how people react to them. And so we try to hide and stuff down all that stuff within us. And we end up putting on a mask. We end up putting on a facade. And so to be I believe to be a true follower of Christ is to get to that point where we can be honest in our faith. No mask. No facade. And you know what? Sometimes that's not pretty. Let's just be honest. We're not perfect. And there are going to be things that if we let truth show, won't always look good. Won't always be whitewashed and perfect on the outside. That means that we need to be honest with our struggles. You know, sometimes I get the impression that there are certain Christians who never struggle. You ask them how it's going, great, awesome, life's perfect, nothing. You know what? That's just not reality. Sometimes we struggle. Sometimes we go through hard things. And we wrestle with that, and we fight with it, and we have a hard time sometimes. You know what? When we're going through those times, we just need to be honest. It is what it is. It's the truth. We just need to be open about that. I would say we need to be honest about our doubts. Do any of you really believe that other Christians never doubt? I mean, sometimes we put on that facade like, oh, I never struggle with doubt. I just believe everything, and I know that God is, always working exactly as I want him to. And no, sometimes we're going to have doubts. When crisis or tragedy strikes our life, sometimes we're going to wrestle with that. We're going to question God, why? Why do I have to go through that? And there are going to be times when the enemy gets into our head, and we're going to begin to even sometimes doubt our own faith. We need to just be honest about that. We need to acknowledge that sometimes we have those struggles, we have those doubts. And you know what? We need to be honest about our sin. If we're trying to put on a facade that gives anyone the impression that we are without sin, that we're living a perfect life, that we never stumble or fall, that we're never tempted, none of us is Christ. None of us is going to live a fully sin-free life. We're striving. We want to be more like Christ. We're trying to live as godly a life as we can. We don't want to sin, but if we're honest, we do. We stumble and fall. We succumb to temptation on occasion. We try not to, but our human nature is what it is, and we're going to have our times of struggle. You see, the Pharisees became experts at condemning everyone else's sin while hiding their own behind a cloak of legalism. As long as they were following the letter, the minutiae of the law, they could pretend that they were righteous and everyone else was a sinner. We're all broken. We all struggle. None of us will go through our entire faith life and never doubt and never struggle and certainly never sin. And so for us to hide that or pretend in some way that that isn't real or that doesn't exist is just a lie. It's untrue. I really want to encourage you today. I want to encourage you. I believe underneath this there is good news. And I want to bring that, and I want to encourage us. If you have ever felt that in order to be a Christian, or in order to be accepted in the body of Christ, in the family of God, if you've ever felt that in order to be loved and respected by those around you within the church, that you somehow had to wear a mask, that you somehow had to put on a facade, that you had to pretend that everything was great when it wasn't great, or you had to act as if you never had any sin when you have sinned, and if you had to pretend that you never doubted when you have doubted. If you have been carrying the weight of that because you thought that that's what you had to do to be a Christian, that's what you had to do to be accepted as a part of the family of God, then I want to say to you today that it's time. It is time to take off the mask and lay it down. It's time to let go of that. And I want to tell you closing here, I want to tell you 3 good reasons why I think you ought to take off the mask. First of all, God is not fooled. You might fool people around you, but God is not fooled. And ultimately, isn't that what matters? I mean, we're not going to stand in judgment before our friends and neighbors around us. We're going to stand one day before God, and that mask, that facade will not mean a thing to God. God sees to the heart. God sees right by it. So if you think the mask is helping you at all when it comes to your relationship with God, it's not. So the first reason we ought to drop it is because God is not impressed. God sees right past that. The second reason I think we really need to drop the mask is because it inhibits our own growth. If we will not acknowledge our doubt, if we will not stand up and acknowledge our struggles, if we won't confess our sin, if we try to hide all that and pretend it's not there, we will never grow. We'll never get any better. We'll never get any stronger. We'll never work through the doubt if we won't acknowledge it. If we always stuff it down and hide it, then we're never going to get any closer to the likeness of Christ. And so we got to drop the mask. Drop the mask because God isn't impressed. Drop the mask because it really is keeping us from growing in Christ. And thirdly, we need to drop the mask because I'm convinced that it is a stumbling block to the lost. You see, when an unsaved person, when a seeker wanders into a church and he sees all these whitewashed people, a whole group of people that all seem to have it all together, and they got no struggles, and they don't question, and there's no doubt, and they don't sin, and if that's the impression the unchurched person has of what it means to be a Christian, because we're putting on the mask and giving them that impression, then we have hindered their salvation. Because they're going to look at it and say, I can't do that. I could never be like that. On the other hand, if an honest pilgrim, a seeker, walks in and they see real people with real struggles, who doubt sometimes, who struggle, who sin, who are just honest, I don't have it all together, but I'm working on it. They can connect to that. They can relate to that because that's where they are. They want to be better, but they also know they've got sin in their life and they know they've got struggle. And so if we pretend that we don't, all we're doing is putting a stumbling block in the path of the unsaved person. And so it's time. It is time. We're talking in this series, it is a Lenten series. We're trying to get deeper here. And we're talking about what it means to be a true friend of God. What it means to be a true follower of Christ. And I want to say to you today, part of that means dropping the mask. Letting the facade go. No longer trying to pretend to be someone we're not. It's not to say we're not striving to be better. In fact, as we drop the mask, we actually are in a better position to grow and to become more in the likeness of Christ. But in that growth process, we should not be pretending to be anything more than we are. That's just a pride thing. We're just doing it for the applause of man, like the Pharisees. So here's what I want to ask you. As Jamie comes and closes us in prayer, if there has been any area of your life where you have been keeping up this mask, if there's been any aspect of your faith life where you have been putting on a facade, trying to pretend that something was better or more than it really is. And I want you to let go of that today. It will be a tremendous moment of freedom for you. You will be letting go of a burden that is way too heavy for any of us to carry. And in so doing, you will be drawing yourself closer to Christ. And so I'm going to invite Jamie to come, and as he prays, I want to ask you to be in prayer. Releasing the mask, dropping the facade, confessing to God and saying, Lord, I want to be honest before you and before others. Let's be in prayer.